In this news roundup of a week for 10th of March 2023. Suggestions come from US intelligence that a pro-Ukraine group was responsible for the Nordstream pipeline explosions. We learned that the UK government had an undisclosed position to reject the lab leak hypothesis in order to keep good relations with China. Massive farmers' protests in Brussels underline how the EU's farm-to-fork sustainability policy is failing in the face of the Ukraine war. And in this week's Short Thought, the horrifying realisation just how badly served today's youngsters have been by the teaching of history. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. On the question of the Nordstream pipeline sabotage, the plot thickened this week as the New York Times reported that US intelligence officials had said that a pro-Ukrainian group carried out the attack, although there's no evidence that the Ukraine state was directly involved. On the one hand, this would explain the anomaly that I'd observed on this before, the fact that Sweden refused to discuss its early findings with its initial investigations. But the fascinating thing is the question that gets raised by the fact that we're hearing this now, and in this way. First of all, let's be clear. Seymour Hersh produced an article alleging the explosions were carried out by America. His piece did not seem that highly credible, given that it was A, wholly dependent on some anonymous source, and B, contained details that didn't stand up to scrutiny. For example, suggesting a specific boat had been used, which was later, with various sources, including satellite imagery, shown to have been nowhere near the area concerned. But now, what do we have here? A story that is the result, once again, of an anonymous source, said to be connected to US intelligence. However, because this story comes via the New York Times, everyone takes this seriously and at face value. They are less likely to give credence to a source that actually doesn't have the connections they claim, I expect, but such a leak of information has a strong likelihood of having been decided and authorized for US military strategic purposes. Doesn't mean it's not true, but doesn't mean either that you should take it that it is. So, should we believe it or should we be sceptical? Well, on the side of believing it, you have the fact that the US would certainly prefer evidence had shown that it was Russia, not a group supporting Ukraine, or even worse, the Ukraine state itself. The discovery of the latter brings with it a risk of backlash, not least in Germany, against Ukraine and its position in the war with Russia. So on that basis, you might think that the US intelligence services, knowing that this had to come out eventually, they are managing the release of the information in a way that at least gives them the opportunity to frame it, to spin it, to do the least damage to their own side. On the other side of being sceptical about this, it's worth noting that up until this latest announcement, everyone had been pretty much agreed that the sophistication of the operations strongly suggested a state-level actor had to be involved. Now all of a sudden we're talking about some unspecified group. So was the earlier speculation wrong, or is the current information not telling the whole story? So while it's good that the US officials, anonymous as they are saying that there's been no evidence of Russian government involvement, that reflects an honesty in conflict unheard of by the Russian state anyway. Nevertheless, while apparently being careful to leave options open, they are certainly trying to avoid pointing the finger directly at Kiev. According to the New York Times, the officials declined to disclose the nature of the intelligence, how it was obtained, or any details of the strength of the evidence that it contains. They said there are no firm conclusions about it, leaving open all sorts of possibilities, including that a group carried it out with the tacit, unofficial support of Kiev. I suppose you could just as easily suggest it was carried out by an independent group with the tacit, unofficial support of, for instance, the US. I think that unlikely personally, but right now there's no evidence against it, and as I've said before, the US certainly has a history of making such interventions. Germany has said that its investigators searched a boat back in January that they said might have been used in the action. Obviously they didn't report this at the time, but presumably have been prompted to do so now by the New York Times report. The German newspaper Die Zeit went into more specifics, suggesting that the attack was carried out by 5 men and a woman who rented a yacht using false passports. Indeed, it said the group consisted of a captain, 2 divers, 2 diving assistants and a doctor. The equipment for the operation was previously transported to the port in a delivery truck. According to the Times of London, Scandinavian diplomats were told just a week after the attack that it had been carried out by, quote, a private venture originating in Ukraine. Tantalisingly, it said that the name of the suspected private sponsor was known to intelligence officials. Since the explosive charges used were only available to the gas and oil industry, the suggestion was maybe an energy sector oligarch might be involved, which would at least give them a very direct motivation with regard to the pipeline. All very interesting and all just speculation. German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius warned against jumping to conclusions. Not a warning everyone took to heart, obviously. He also muttered something about the possibility that the operation could have been a false flag operation by Russia to blame Ukraine. It was said without much conviction, and I have to say I don't think it carries much credence. Russia certainly has in the past carried out false flag attacks. It's something that it does, although not usually with a high level of competence that this would have required. But if Russia had carried this out as a false flag attack, it would be hard to understand why it didn't accuse Ukraine from the beginning, in line with the false flag, rather than accusing the UK, as it did initially. So the puzzle continues. Right now, people are only telling us what they think we should know, giving away little of the specific evidence that they say they have one way or the other. It is not satisfactory. But there it is. I rather think that more has to come out eventually. Come out in the way that rather a lot has been coming out recently about how the UK government actually managed the COVID-19 pandemic, namely badly. Most of the significant disclosures from the leaked WhatsApp messages from the former Health Secretary Matt Hancock came, as you would expect, in the first few days, which we covered last week. But one fascinating tidbit made its way into the second week, which is that Hancock was told by the government to remove a section in his book that referenced the lab leak hypothesis for the origin of COVID-19. Any former minister has to get their memoirs cleared by the current government cabinet office to make sure they're not exposing national secrets and the like. And in this case, Hancock had made a comment that Beijing's explanation for the natural origin of COVID just doesn't fly. But in correspondence linked to the Telegraph, the Cabinet Office pushed back, telling him that the government's position was to support the contention that the outbreak's location in Wuhan, the site of a biolab examining bat coronaviruses, remember, was entirely coincidental. This position was never stated publicly, mind. Hancock was told that to go astray from that narrative risked damaging national security, which apparently is code for pissing off the Chinese government. This comes at a point when Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is expected to set out a new defence and security strategy, which is reported to take a less aggressive tone towards China than that of his short-lived predecessor Liz Truss. It seems from this disclosure that such a less aggressive tone includes avoiding rocking the boat in making any kind of frank appraisal of the origin of COVID. All of this was news to me, I must say. While the US has been stepping up in a very confrontational way to recent Chinese actions, I hadn't quite taken in how silent the UK had fallen on the same topic. But if you want to know why some people discussing the topic in public are shunned, discouraged, talked down, you have some clues of it right there. Power politics still rules the world over objective inquiry without fear nor favour. Apparently. This came as the US House of Representatives held the first of a series of public hearings on the origins of COVID-19. One of the focus points for Republicans on the committee was the recent suggestion that Anthony Fauci had actively steered the scientific community to dismiss the idea of a lab leak at the start of the pandemic. This came from recently publicised emails around the commissioning of the early scientific paper on proximal origins of COVID-19 that was highly influential, as we've discussed before, in shutting down early speculation about a lab leak. Fauci had had a meeting with a number of the authors shortly in advance of the paper's publication, and he had referred to the paper in his own answers to questions. But only with some of those recent emails was it noted that he was named as having been one of the instigators of the paper, not just a bystander, which is not what you would have taken from his response to a question at a press conference on April 17th, 2020, where he said that a group of highly qualified evolutionary virologists had written a paper disproving the lab leak theory, although he didn't have the authors' names to hand at the time, which would be an odd comment if it turned out you were intimately involved with writing said paper. One of the paper's co-authors, Christian Anderson, said that he'd been prompted to write the paper by Fauci with the express goal of disproving the lab leak theory. Perhaps on the same principle that led, we now learn, to then President of CNN, Jeff Zucker, to refuse to allow his journalists to look into the possibility because he saw it as, quote, a Trump talking point. Not everyone was a fan of the focus on Fauci, though. One of the witnesses at the committee hearings, Jamie Metzl, who's been one of the most consistent campaigners for the lab leak to be taken seriously, said the focus on Fauci was political and unhelpful, when it should really have been on the actions of China. I should say as well that in a statement afterwards, Fauci rejected the accusations against him, saying that his only goal was to stimulate scientific evaluation, and he added this: I had stated repeatedly that we must keep an open mind as to the origins of the virus. Mind you, Fauci wasn't the only one feeling the heat. Dr. Jeremy Farrar, former director of the Wellcome Trust and newly appointed to the World Health Organization as chief scientist, was shown to have made direct edits to the Proximal Origins paper, uncredited mind, to make it more solidly against a lab leak, specifically changing a word that said it was unlikely to be a lab leak to saying instead it was improbable. In an email sent by Dr. Ian Lipkin, Farrar was thanked for, quote, shepherding the paper, suggesting significant involvement. Various people have accordingly called for WHO to think again about his appointment. In his testimony to the House Committee, Dr. Robert Redfield, former head of the CDC, said that Fauci and Farrar had started to exclude him from calls because of his insistence that a lab leak was the most likely explanation. It was told to me that they wanted a single narrative and that I obviously had a different point of view, he said. Science has debate, and they squashed any debate. Fauci has denied that anyone was excluded, saying that there were several others who likewise had the opinion it was an engineered virus who were in the calls. It's worth noting, of course, that none of this is about any change whatsoever in any of the underlying science about what happened. What's unravelling, or not, before our eyes are the institutional responses to the crisis and whether the scientific establishment, writ large, followed the same instincts that we now learn the UK government was following, namely, don't upset China. Well, the UK and the scientific community were not alone in that, as the EU has been showing very similar tendencies, although arguably China is the least of its problems. At the end of last week, Brussels was paralysed by a huge protest of farmers in an echo of recent pushback in the Netherlands. 2,700 tractors came into the city from the Flanders region protesting about planned cuts which farmers feel will put them out of business. And as with the Netherlands farmers, the source of it is the EU rules on nitrate pollution, in response to which the Dutch government produced proposals to slash emissions by up to 70%. A spokesman for the Belgian Farmers Association said that the rules meant a lot of farms will have to limit the amount of animals they keep or simply close down. This is just the cutting edge, where centralised environmental targets from the EU are meeting a harsh reality for how food is grown. And the focus has particularly been on the Netherlands and now on Belgium, because both countries are high food producers and exporters. And the question has been raised, well, if your answer to the pollution created by food production is to reduce the amount of food you produce, who makes up the shortfall in food that you created by doing that? And how do they deal with the pollution that their food production creates? This is just the visible end of how, since the eruption of the war in Ukraine, the EU's idealistic farm-to-fork policy is coming under increasing challenge. If you recall, farm-to-fork has targets by 2030 to cut the use of pesticides by 50% and reducing fertiliser use by 20%. In order to do that, it proposed increasing the amount of farmland used for organic farming to 25% of all land by 2030, a massive increase on less than 10% today. At least some environmentalists are huge fans of the project. This article in the journal Nature Food praised it as representing a first step towards genuine food systems governance, well timed to address some of the most pressing environmental and public health concerns that European society faces. But the problem is organic agriculture produces reduced yields, a fact shown time and again with multiple studies. Indeed, an impact assessment from Wageningen University in 2021 said that farm-to-fork would decrease the EU's crop yield between 10 to 20%. So if you're measuring impact per unit of food produced, rather than per acre of land farmed, it's questionable whether it actually represents an improvement at all. Instead, it just displaces food production elsewhere. Less food produced here means somewhere more has to be produced to make up for shortfall, and you export your emissions to wherever that happens. And that could put upward pressure on global food prices as a result. You might have noticed that's something that we've already seen, mostly thanks to the effects of the war in Ukraine, but also with a certain amount of extreme climate events in other major food growing regions. So pressure has been going up in the European Parliament on the subject, informed by the fact that Ukraine generally would be responsible for almost half of Europe's cereal imports and nearly 3/4 of its vegetable oils. Unsurprisingly, this has led to a slowing of momentum for farm-to-fork, and that has led to major clashes of principle. The farm-to-fork supporters don't want to slow down at all, saying that the disruptions from the war are temporary, the urgency of climate change means it has to be pushed ahead completely, whereas their opponents are arguing that the Ukraine war simply highlights why those targets were never sensible in the first place, and the whole thing needs to be reconsidered, alongside looking again at technological solutions that the EU has tended to be rather cold on, for example, genetically modified crops. The arguments are gaining ground, pun not intended. For instance, French President Macron said that the original strategy was based on a pre-Ukraine war world and needed to be reviewed. And the farmers' pushback, not just in two countries, but across many others, led to pesticide reduction plans effectively being shelved last year, pending a more thorough impact assessment. In January, the Politico website revealed it had seen an internal commission document considered so sensitive it carried instructions that officials shouldn't read it in public places. And the document basically admits that many of the more far-reaching reforms are stuck, with various EU countries divided around the effect of the plans. All of which suggests that the farmers' protests are hitting a key fault line in the EU political programmes and have a chance of making a real impact. It's not wholly straightforward. EU President Ursula von der Leyen has staked a lot of her personal weight on the farm-to-fork initiative, and those things get defended quite viciously. But ideology and wishful thinking doesn't simply remove basic reality on the ground. It seems likely that the consequences of the targets of environmental campaigners have greater consequences than many of the EU members will happily endure. There was a fairly disturbing column in the Times of London last week by Jenny Russell. Let me read part of it to you. Last week, I mentioned to a youngster friend that 70 years ago, my father had volunteered to help build a hospital in rural Zululand. My friend, a graduate in his 30s with friends and siblings in their 20s, was surprised. Were some people actually idealistic in the past? Were they motivated by decency? That wasn't his impression, or that of his generation. What we hear is that basically everything in the past was wicked. Everyone was out for themselves. It was cruel and exploitative. That's why there's so much we have to fight for now. That is a failure of education, and I hadn't quite absorbed how widespread a thing it has become. Apparently, only 1 in 5 children now study history after the age of 14. Much of that history teaching focuses on the Tudors, the Nazis, British Empire and slavery. Actual history teaches us how much we are the same as those who came before, as well as how change happens, but the modern version of history seems to be a political screed on how terrible everyone who came before was, because their values weren't the same as modern values, and therefore how much better we are than they were. Jenny Russell said that while every new generation of youngsters has their moment of criticising the generation that preceded them, yeah, I did that, this could be the first one to imagine that they invented virtue. They are the first ones to think they should work on the project of creating a fairer society. It's a conceit that is staggering in how ahistorical and ignorant it is. History teaches us that human society is rich, many-layered, that many things have been striven for, some successfully, but never creating a utopia as a result, many unsuccessfully being riven by unintended consequences. History teaches us to admire remarkable people in spite of their imperfections, because imperfections are universal, but greatness isn't. It teaches us, if you bother to look for it, that people throughout all times, including the times of great hardship and savagery, have been defined by creativity, compassion, endurance, heroism, as well as, yes, a capacity for cruelty and vengefulness. History gives us perspective, how attempts to create perfect societies fall short, about how human values differ in ways that create conflict and a need for trade-offs, that you cannot have societies that are free, rich and equal all at the same time, and you can always point to what you don't have while ignoring the benefits of what you do have. If we have really created a younger generation that is cut loose from any sense of recognition of where they came from the human pool of learning and knowledge of history, that is the most egregious mistake we ever made. Far more worthy of judgment than that of embracing fossil fuels in the 1800s or organising the world around imperialism for most of human history up until the 1900s. If I was talking to a young person today about how to make enough sense of the world to be able to successfully change it, I might talk about the solid understanding of science. Sure, lots of things to be said about that, but I would surely start with the admonition to read history. Read it across numerous nations and time spans. It will teach you more about yourself and your surroundings than any number of modern studies on human psychology. It'll teach you as well that battlefields and similar grim end places are littered with the corpses of people who failed to understand reality with clarity and therefore acted on faulty premises. It might just help you to avoid being exactly one of those people. Alright, my thanks as always to the people who support this channel on Patreon. As you know, I would not be able to produce these videos without that support. If you would like to add yours for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.